Hello and welcome to Heroes and Humans of Football. My name is Mehreen.
And I'm Simon Cooper. This is the football show where we take the hero and we show you the human.
From Johan Cruyff to Megan Rapinoe.
And from George Best to Kylian Mbappe.
This is the Human Football Podcast. Today's episode is coming to you in sad circumstances following the death of Sven-Göran Eriksson, England's first foreign manager and a serial winner of titles in his native Sweden, Portugal and Italy. When he arrived in 2001, the English saw the softly spoken Sven as a dull figure who looked more like an accountant than an English gaffer. But he soon became tabloid fodder at the height of the British media's intrusion into celebrity private lives and the peak of the wives and girlfriends wag culture. Sven was at times the most talked about man in England in the noughties, ahead of David Beckham and Tony Blair, and he even had a horrifically catchy World Cup song named after him. This is the story of a small-town Swedish boy who became a globetrotter, involved in one of the biggest football frauds in history, where he ended up in North Korea and then fell into financial ruin. In this episode, we explore Sven's legacy in England and beyond and talk about how he became ensnared in the 21st century era of football's shady money, celebrity and tabloid drama. Today we're going to be joined in the studio by Olof Lundh, a TV journalist from Sweden who knew Sven throughout his life. But before he joins us, Simon, why don't you give us some stats?
Well, Sven-Göran Eriksson, who's just died of pancreatic cancer, was the first foreigner to coach England from 2001 to 2006. And he was knocked out 3 times in quarterfinals in 3 consecutive tournaments, in charge of what was then called the golden generation of English talent. But Sven managed his greatest ever team, in his own words, at Lazio, between 1997 and 2001. There he won 7 trophies in 3 years, including the Serie A title, the Scudetto, for only the second time in Lazio's history in 2000 with a fantastic team. And his career, his big-time career, started in Gothenburg in the early 80s, where he led the small-time club with part-time semi-pros to the UEFA Cup triumph of 1982. A plumber who only trained after 1 p.m. scored in the final. It was the first time any Swedish club had won European silverware. He was undoubtedly the greatest ever Swedish manager.
Simon, what are your memories of Sven?
Well, I interviewed him a couple of times, and I remember when he became England manager, I thought, brilliant. I just interviewed that guy at Lazio Roma not long ago because I was moonlighting for a TV channel. We were at Lazio, did a training ground interview with him, and I'm going through my notebook thinking, I've got gold in my notebook. The new England manager just gave me an interview. And I looked and he'd said nothing. There was nothing that he'd said that was of any interest at all. And that was part of Sven's genius.
Did it endear you to England more that there was finally a foreigner in charge, given that you thought English football was generally
Neanderthal.
in the pits, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, obviously they should have appointed foreign managers much earlier.
Johan Cruyff in the late 80s.
Yeah, already then it was a bit late. Probably Rinus Michels in the 70s would have been a good start.
Yeah.
But it was a step towards civilization. And I think now English football has reached a developmental level where they don't even need foreigners so much because the English game has been thoroughly Europeanized. But at the time, before Sven took over, it was so thoroughly backward that, yeah, I mean, he was like a development worker. So what are your memories of Sven?
So Sven took over the English team when I was a kid and when I was first beginning to love football, which means that my memories of this entire period are like they happened yesterday. They're incredibly vivid. And it was also the period which started my quite complicated, very toxic relationship with England because, you know, as we're going to talk about, this was the era of celebrity culture where footballers became celebrities, where every 2 years in England, in the summers, the country was gripped by this sense of entitlement that this was going to be the year that they were going to do it. England, I think, as an entity, are far different now, given the nature of the players and
much
the competition.
More likeable, I find.
Far more likeable, but I'll be honest, I just can't really ever get over my formative years in England as a football fan, having to see this team, fail perennially and all the hysteria that surrounded them all the time. It was insufferable.
It's funny, I remember somebody once saying to me, the years between 10 and 20 are more or less when all your football knowledge and affiliations and loves are formed.
Definitely. And, you know, this was an era where England, the St. George's flag, the It's Coming Home memes all started. And it was also an era, I think, of huge entitlement, polite racism, rather than some of the stuff, nasty stuff that you saw in earlier decades around England, and the celebrification of footballers. To be honest, it really turned me off international football altogether and made me the sort of diehard club fan that I am, which is why I'm wearing very proudly my Swedish Chelsea shirt in honour of the great man.
In our episode on Kylian Mbappe, you said you support France, which I let go at the time, but actually with hindsight is really quite weird, given you also have a conflictual relationship with France. So you support France because you don't like England?
Well, France back then were what England have become now. I saw a team full of black and brown players. And also my first memory of a World Cup was France 98. And I think when the host country wins the World Cup, it does do something to you. I also used to play a lot of video games. And when you played video games which had international tournaments, they played the national anthem. And I'll be honest, the Marseillaise, absolute banger.
Marseillaise is the best national anthem.
Yeah. That song lives rent-free in my head. So my affiliations with France are quite complicated, but they do stem out of the fact that I kind of hated England, as well as the fact that France team winning the World Cup in 98, which had two Chelsea players in it at the time, Massa Desailly and Frank Leboeuf. Deschamps would also go on and join Chelsea a couple of years later, meant that it was a very easy choice for me to make that it had to be France.
And I have to say that liking the Marseillaise more than God Save the Queen is a completely objective assessment, because the Beatles didn't use God Save the Queen to inspire the opening bars of All You Need Is Love.
Truth.
And then there was this sense of entitlement, and then this kind of idea that we're still in World War II and we're just going to sing World War II songs all the time. And these toy newspapers that people would carry around, the Mail and the Sun, and it just seemed so absurd to me, and it wasn't good either. For me also, because I covered all this as a journalist, I was writing football pretty much full time during the Eriksson era in England. For me, what remains is the just enormous dominance of the tabloids over both football and British life more broadly. And the tabloids had two main subjects, one which was sex and the other football. And the beauty of Eriksson was that he brought those two stories together.
He was a gift, wasn't he? And the way the media works in the UK, or traditionally has worked when people read newspapers and watched the TV, was that every morning newspapers would come out and the broadcast journalists would see what was in the newspapers and then use that material or those lines to populate their news channels for the rest of the day. So you just had a circular media environment where they just feed off each other, and it was inescapable. You couldn't just go on Twitter or watch YouTube. This was the only thing around.
We're going to come to the bizarre grip of the tabloids in the days when people still bought newspapers and funded those horrendous publications.
Yeah, I guess this is also a story about our industry as much as it is, Sven.
Yeah, you and I as journalists, we live this very deeply. We know how newspapers get money or don't get money. And in the early 2000s, the Mail and the Sun were just brimming with cash, so they could pay dozens of people to doorstep Sven, and as we'll find out, to phone tap Sven. We're going to get to the most spectacular and weird periods of Sven's life. First foreigner to coach England, his bust-ups with the tabloids, the defeats on penalties, the love affairs. But we're going to start with the origins. We're going to talk to Olof Lundh, Swedish journalist and author, about where Sven comes from and the forces that made him. Thank you very much, Olof, for coming.
Thank you. It's an honor.
Tell us where Sven comes from in Sweden. Tell us about his origins.
He comes from more of a rural area and very close to the border of Norway, in the middle of the country. He comes from as we say, folkhemmet, when the Social Democrats came to power in the 30s in Sweden, and they tried to create a better society for everyone. And he's kind of coming from that upbringing that everyone has to have a chance, everyone has to have an education, and he's kind of a symbol in a way for folkhemmet.
And it's important for Sven because he's born near the bottom of society in 1948, as you say, in a very rural area of Sweden, to quite working class parents who are not together. So he's born in secret.
Yes, because there was moral laws in Sweden at that time that you didn't have children without being married. So it's kind of born without wedlock.
He said, "My father was a little too young to be a father. I was not planned." And in his first years, in his early years, he's growing up with his mother alone. The father is not at that point living with them. Small room in Torsby without water and electricity. For Sweden, this is really quite near the bottom.
Definitely it is. And of course, everything that happened in society, most of it happened in the big cities. There wasn't these big programs to build apartment buildings in Torsby.
I'm told he's always kept his Torsby accent. He sounds like a kind of tree cutter, somebody described it to me.
Yeah, he always kept the way he was and the way he talked, where he grew up. It followed him wherever he went in the world. And I think that made Sven the person he was, that he, in many ways, he never changed. And it was great when you went up and interviewed him. He was maybe coach for one of the big teams in Europe, and you went home to him and his parents. He brought you there, and you got coffee, cookies and everything. And they were all very humble and very, in a way, still in Torsby. It didn't matter what had happened or how much money he had made. He was still very much Sven, the son of these very simple persons, but very nice persons.
Olaf, how does Sven first discover football?
He played like most kids did, and he was okay, but he was not that significant. And in a way, it was very much a coach that helped him, Tord Grip, that followed him many years later. But he was the one who kind of encouraged him, both as a player, but also as taking the steps to be a coach, that football could be more than just playing for your local team. He didn't have any ambitions that football would take him somewhere. I think he realized that he had his limits as a player and that he also had the limits of growing up where he grew up.
Yeah, there wasn't much training and there were no places to play indoors during the long winters. He said, "My dream was to play professionally somewhere, but I wasn't good enough." And people who saw him concur. In Joe Lovejoy's biography of him, he's described as an Enfield Town sort of right back. And another eyewitness says, "I don't think anybody in those days admired how he played football, but he was very passionate."
That's the description I've also had from, I spoke a lot with Tord Grip, his friend and coach. He couldn't see the talents in Sven as a player, but he saw other traits that you could use in football.
His dad is a massive Liverpool fan, so that's where he gets it from. They grew up watching Liverpool on TV. I guess all Swedes in that era they have an English team.
He says that Swedes were more interested in English football than they were in Swedish football, and English football felt like their domestic league almost.
It was like that, and it's kind of strange when you look back at that time because the Swedish Federation had so much power, so they didn't want the English league to compete with the Swedish league. So it was forbidden to show English games when the Swedish league was active. We only saw English football from November to March. So we never got to see the winner. It's incredible. It's like watching a Netflix version, just seeing half the show. It's incredible that we accepted it. And then we got to see the FA Cup final. That's kind of the end of it. But we never saw the dramatic ends of the league season. So we only saw between November and March, but that was enough to make it a passion. And that's why it's still hugely popular. And it's kind of like a rival. And the TV rights, the value of Premier League is much higher than the Swedish league today.
So Sven realizes he's not going to become a great player. He goes into coaching. And at the time, there's a kind of civil war in Swedish football between English-style 4-4-2 with zonal marking and German-style man marking, where the Germans had this libero playing behind the defense. Complicated tactical war. And the revolutionaries on the English side are these two young English coaches from Croydon who come to Sweden one after the other. First Bob Houghton and then Roy Hodgson. And Sven becomes an adept. He's on their side in the civil war. And he actually goes to see Bobby Robson and ends up sitting on the Ipswich bench, right?
Yeah, so he's writing to English coaches saying, "Can I come and watch you train?" And Bobby Robson, who's probably the nicest man who's ever existed in English football, not only invites him to training, but also says, "Why don't you come and watch our match against Villa and you can sit in the dugout?" And
yeah, because Sven
like,
says, I'm going to buy a ticket for the stands at your game tomorrow. And Robson says, "No, do you want to sit in the dugout?"
So the first experience Sven has in an English football managing dugout is at Portman Road with Ipswich with the great Bobby Robson.
And then he gets this very exciting phone call from IFK Gothenburg.
IFK Gothenburg is one of the big clubs in Sweden, and they had a rough time in the 70s. They needed a new coach, and they were recommended Sven-Göran Eriksson, and he decided to take it up. It's quite a challenge because it's an established team with a lot of stars. Many of them are older than Sven at the time.
He's about 30 and he says to himself, "I don't think anyone knew who I was," when he goes to IFK.
Not very many who knew. Of course, some knew. It's kind of like telling that Sven can walk into this classic Swedish club with a lot of stars at the time and still be in charge.
Miraculously, this semi-professional team wins the UEFA Cup in 1982.
It was incredible. It was like a fairy tale. And at that time, Swedish football was stronger. In a way, when Sven takes over for Gothenburg, he molds them together. And when you talk to players who had him at the time, it was not only the tactics. He had this English style, but it was also the way he handled human beings. He understood that he had to do one thing to Torbjörn Nilsson, the forward, and do another to Conny Karlsson, who was a defender. He was very modern in that way. It was a leadership that it wasn't common in football, and I would say it wasn't common in society at all.
And they beat Hamburg in that final. They're huge underdogs, and it's the triumph of the English philosophy against the German philosophy.
Yeah, and they beat Valencia, and actually the club is broke at the time, so it was really challenging. And they beat Hamburg both home and away. It's impossible to think that Gothenburg won the UEFA Cup today. I mean, today it feels like it's incredible.
Is it still the only time a Swedish club has ever won a European trophy?
Actually, Gothenburg won it 1987 with quite a few of the players and the people who worked with Sven-Göran Eriksson. So in the 80s, what Sven created at Gothenburg, it kind of resonated for many, many years. They were such a dominant force.
Well, he's only 34 when they won the UEFA Cup, and decades later, after he's diagnosed with terminal cancer, he said, "I get down on my knees and thank all the footballers and also the board that Gothenburg became what it became in 82. And so he becomes this European superstar. This very calm, quite boring man is brought to Benfica. And so he's thrust into the frenzy of football in Portugal, later Italy, clubs with millions of fans, insane club presidents. He's this small town boy who's discovering the world.
In his Volvo.
Into this world of celeb, stars and media. He coaches Benfica. They win the league twice. And then Sven tells his story. He's leaving the training ground in his car, and there's this car after him with a siren on. Eventually Sven stops. The guy gets out and says, "I'm from the Italian embassy." And Sven says, "Ah, yes, what do you want?" The guy says, "I want your phone number because Roma wants you as a manager next season." So he goes to Roma, then Fiorentina, back to Benfica. They reach the European Cup final. And I asked Hans Backer, who was his assistant, how did Sven work? And Backer said, well, every day we came to work, he'd go around everyone in the club and say hello to everyone in the office, in the kitchen, say hello to the groundsman. And Sven memorized the names of all these people who worked for the club. No previous manager had ever looked at these people. No previous manager would ever go into the kitchen. But Sven's idea is everyone had to be seen. I suppose it's a kind of the equality of the Sweden he'd grown up in, right?
I would say that that's what he brings with him, the leadership and the way of looking at people. It's very important who takes care of the kitchen or everything around a club. And I think he valued people in a way. And that's what is such a nice thing with him, that he kind of saw everyone.
And then, I would say the peak of his career really is at Lazio, right?
Definitely at Lazio. A club that always has ambitions, but hasn't won that many titles. Finally, he takes them to a league title, and I think everyone saw how skillful manager he was. I mean, when they won the Serie A title, I think that was the peak of his career as a coach and definitely as a club coach.
Thanks, Olof. Olof is going to join us again at the end of the show when we talk about Sven's legacy, what it all meant. But right now, Mehreen and I are going to talk about England, the crazy 5 years that Sven spent in the impossible job.
Join us after the break.
Want to shop Walmart Black Friday deals first? Walmart Plus members get early access to our hottest deals. Join now and get 50% off a 1-year annual membership. Shop Black Friday deals first with Walmart Plus. See terms at walmartplus.com.
This is a reminder that you're listening to Heroes and Humans of Football with me, Simon Cooper.
And me, Mehreen Khan. Welcome back. So you join us as we're about to discover how Sven transitions from being a very successful manager in Serie A to becoming the manager of England, a football culture that he's always been obsessed by and which was very close to his heart.
And we're also going to discover how the only Swede who doesn't speak brilliant English, who looks like a small town accountant but has a penchant for illicit love affairs, is going to cope with English football as the first foreign manager and, more importantly, with the British tabloid press.
Simon, what were your experiences being a football writer in the rabid era of the red tops in the UK?
Well, England were followed by an enormous number of journalists because the tabloids were just bulging with money. I mean, I think the Mail and the Sun were still selling 3 million odd copies in those days. The internet existed, but nobody really got their news from it. So people would buy a newspaper every day or have it home delivered. And there was still this idea that, well, obviously it's our manifest destiny to win every World Cup. We should be winning every World Cup because, the game was invented, modern game was codified in England more accurately in 1863. if we don't win the World Cup, then it's due to the manager, because everything, the idea was, stems from the manager. And there was this enormous obsession with the England manager, because the way English football works is only the manager speaks to the press. The players are sort of like silent actors. Sven would give these press conferences with sometimes literally hundreds of journalists there. Because Sven was deliberately boring, there was this kind of stalemate situation. What are we going to write? All he said is, well, I think it will be a good game, but I think we will play well. When he takes over, he's the fourth England manager in 4 years. And this is the time when people are calling it the impossible job because of this tabloid frenzy around it. And this is long before Gareth Southgate made the job come to seem quite dull and easy, like being a senior civil servant. There was still this idea then that you had to have an Englishman manage the national team, because otherwise it was a cop-out. And so they were going through the last semi-plausible people who could be England manager.
Who was left?
Well, by the time Sven comes along, nobody. So Glenn Hoddle had to go after saying that disabled people were paying for sins committed in previous lives. And then came Kevin Keegan, because the idea also, the manager needs not just be an Englishman, but also has to have been a great English footballer.
Yeah.
Don't know why.
I love it if we beat them.
Keegan was a great speaker, but as he admitted...
He had the passion, didn't he?
He exuded this kind of passion, yeah. But
Just
as he admitted, yeah, that's very well described.
It was, right?
And I think a very nice man, but as he admitted, he didn't really care about tactics or know about tactics. He called it noughts and crosses. And so, you're already getting these really good English club teams, above all Arsene Wenger's Arsenal. Listen to the Arsene Wenger episodes that we made about how Wenger transforms English football in this period. But the national team's still a bit backward in Neanderthal. And so in desperation, when Keegan resigns, the FA thinks, well, there's nobody left in England. So
to go abroad. And at that point, he is one of the most successful managers in Europe. He's doing things with Lazio that have never been done before. And Sven doesn't really think twice about this when he gets the call.
Yeah, so tell us how it happens.
England have just lost against Germany in a qualifier for the 2002 World Cup. And Keegan does this press conference where he knows it's game up and he's gone. He's out. Losing to Germany is always embarrassing. They are the old enemy and it hurts English football psyches more than probably any other types of defeat. He's a dead man walking and he's gone. And within a couple of hours, Sven says he gets a call and he looks at his phone and sees a UK number. And he gets a call from a senior FA official who says, "Hello, Sven, how are you? We might have a job coming up. Would you be interested?" And he's like, "What kind of job?" And he's like, "The England job." And Sven says, "Well, it's impossible. I can't be England manager. I'm not English." And so they politely say goodbye. Then he gets another call again a week later asking him if he's still interested. It's planted a seed in his head. And eventually England keep calling and Sven says, "Well, yeah, sure, I'll become the first foreign manager of England." He doesn't really think twice. It is, in his words, a brilliant job, and leaving Lazio behind was a pretty easy decision. I don't think he was torn about it in any way.
Yeah, although with hindsight, he talks about maybe having made the wrong decision, leaving the best team he would ever coach.
Given the treatment that he subsequently suffered, of course.
Well, I heard this account from a Swede that when he really gets offered the job, his agent, Athel, still calls. And he's having this wonderful dinner out in Rome with his assistant and best friend, Tord Grip. So Eriksson chats on the phone in English, and then he turns to Grip and he says, "What do you say to being my assistant manager with England?" And a Swedish friend who's dining with them shouts, "Never England, that's bad food, ugly women, and terrible weather." But by this point, Eriksson and Grip are already talking about which players to pick, because England have a lot of talent at that point. It is kind of exciting.
Michael Owen broke through, yeah.
You've got this
still
wonderful
around.
midfielders, not a wonderful midfield, but wonderful midfielders of Beckham, Scholes, Gerrard and Lampard. And I say this as somebody who's never supported England. These are 4 world-class players in midfield. There's potential there. And also, I'm not going to go into this ugly women slur. But anyway, Sven thought, well, I'll just import all these women anyway. And he'd grown up loving English football, as we've discussed. These Saturday afternoons in Torsby watching Liverpool on TV. And so he goes.
But this appointment is far from uncontroversial, and the tabloids, who become very important later on, are not happy with the fact that Sven-Göran Eriksson, this odd-looking bloke that I imagine most people in the UK didn't really know much about him, even though Serie A was a very important league at this point.
Yeah, but it wasn't very important in England. I mean, this was a completely insular national football culture. So, yeah, nobody had any idea.
I was watching Italian football on Channel 4.
You were a hipster. You were a child hipster.
Okay, maybe.
But yeah, the Tabs are not happy. So the Sun organises a protest. I mean, this is
how much money they had.
How much money they had. They could do fake grassroots protests. The comedian Jeremy Hardy comments, "I don't know why everyone's making such a fuss about a foreign manager when it's having all those English players in the team that's the problem," which is accurate. And there's this brilliant lament in the Daily Mail, of course, the home of British nostalgia, English nostalgia, by Jeff Powell. So when Eriksson is appointed, Powell writes, "The mother country of soccer, birthplace of the greatest game, has finally gone from the cradle to the shame. We sell our birthright down the fjord to a nation of 7 million skiers and hammer throwers who spend half their year living in total darkness." And he doesn't really speak good English, which is a massive asset.
He's got an accent, hasn't he?
Well, he's got an accent. He has a very small vocabulary, about the size of the Sun's vocabulary. This is a big advantage because it means that his press conferences are quite brief.
He has that staccato, classic kind of Scandinavian cadence about him, short sentences. You couldn't spin his words.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't deal in any
was no
kind
colour.
Because I mean, with Keegan, it was all colour.
It was all bluster, right?
Yeah, and England managers used to use these kind of World War II language
Clichés,
of,
yeah.
You'd want him on your side in the trenches.
Yeah.
He'll be the first one over the top. We got to get out there when, the bullets are flying, this kind of stuff. And Sven didn't do anything like that. He made it seem really boring.
There was something clinical about him, even the way that he looked.
So he arrives and he looks like an accountant, say, from a Norwegian provincial town. Doesn't look like the world's best paid manager, which he was. He has this cheap shoes, the trousers are hitched a couple of inches too high, and the only attempts at some kind of spark and individuality are his spectacles have these blue rims.
No, they're rimless.
They're
They have
rimless.
no rims, right? You just see this little speck of blue here in the middle. And I thought these were the coolest things that I've ever seen. I actually wanted a pair. I was influenced by Sven-Göran Eriksson. He was an early fashion influencer. And I disagree. I thought he looked cool. He had this sort of permatan, which maybe he picked up in Italy. There was something of the night about him, to misquote what was said about Michael Howard. I thought he was a bit of a vibe, a bit villainous.
Villainous?
Yeah.
I've never heard anyone say that.
The hair, the vampirish hairline.
Right, so you thought there was something dangerous about
There
Sven.
was a little bit something dangerous about him.
right.
I was digging Sven, to be honest.
well, I mean, as
Each to their own.
we know, a lot of
A
women
lot of
did.
women did.
Yeah. And because he doesn't speak much English, that helps him deal with the tabloid insanity surrounding him because he makes everything seem a bit boring. He was about the only unhysterical person in English football. And I remember when he was England manager, I used to go to this football conference in Zurich, this football business conference, run by a good man called Marcel Schmidt. And Sven would go sometimes. And I remember one year we're all sitting around the table with him, all of us journalists, and we're thinking, great, this is the England manager, we'll get him talking. And, we're asking him questions. Sven was very clever. He found this Chinese journalist at the table and he begins asking this Chinese guy questions about Chinese football. Sven is, so tell me about your league. And in the end, he does end up in the league. So maybe
It's quite useful.
He scouts him for
Prescient,
future
yeah.
jobs. But he had this very strange ability of a kind of A-lister to ask questions, to deflect attention from himself. There was nothing egomaniac about him.
Was he scared of journalists? Like when you saw him in the pack, was he?
He was totally able to deal with them. He was very sort of unflinching. He didn't seem to take it too seriously. I spoke to his later assistant, Hans Bakker, and Hans had known Sven since they were in a training course at the start of the 80s. Hans becomes his assistant later in his last few jobs. And Hans said to him, this tabloid destruction of your life, everything they wrote about you, it must have been so hurtful. And Sven said, no, I didn't care. Hans said, everybody cares. Everybody cares what's said about you in the headline. Nobody is indifferent to that. And Sven said, no, I didn't care.
Do you think it was true?
I think it's more complicated than that. I think there was some pain that his private life was so thoroughly uncovered, as anyone would feel that. But Bakker says, look, a lot of coaches would have committed suicide, having their lives exposed to the world in that way. But Sven was almost indifferent to it.
I mean, now we're in the era where footballers, sports people talk a lot about mental health. The tabloids, of course, have been totally defanged in the last couple of years. You just wouldn't get 5 years of incessant daily treatment. This guy, every time you opened a newspaper, there'd be a double page spread of a long lens of him with a girlfriend, him in a restaurant, him on a holiday.
What Britain does really well is produce celebrity. And it's partly the royals, it's partly music and partly football. And all those worlds kind of coalesce around Sven. He's in them all. So he even hangs out with the Queen and Prince Philip.
Yeah, and as you said on Small Talk, he is the king of small talk. He describes a visit to Buckingham Palace while he's still manager. And these dinners at Buckingham Palace with the Queen and Prince Philip are very regimented affairs. But he's got a plum seat. On one side, Prince Philip, and the other side, the Queen. And the dinners are so regimented that there's a structure to them. In the first parts of the dinner, you're only allowed to speak to the guest who's sitting on your immediate left. And for Sven, this is Prince Philip. Prince Philip very quickly emerges, has sub-zero interest in football and only wants to talk about polo. Sven, who knows absolutely nothing about polo, manages to feign enough interest and I think ask enough questions that he gets through it.
He probably says, Mr. Philip, polo, very interesting. You explain to me.
You make him sound like Tarzan. But then the second half of the day, he's like, okay, this is the main draw. I've got the Queen. But, I mean, after a very brief exchange about Michael Owen and why the Queen thinks...
No, you say it's a brief exchange. I find it fascinating because you're not allowed to report what the Queen says to you, but Sven does. Sven asks the Queen, which is, I suppose, a kind of ice-breaking question. Who do you think is the best player in the England team? And the Queen says, Michael Owen. And Sven says, why? And the Queen says, well, he looks so clean. He did look clean.
Yeah, he was a fresh-faced young boy. And probably the only part member of that team, maybe apart from Beckham, that she knew. Because he then also says that she had very, very little interest in football.
No, I don't think football was big in that generation.
I don't think they were
royals.
talking noughts and crosses.
No. But anyway, so, the Queen probably thinking, who is this man? I saw him in the Mail.
Over and over again.
Over and over again. And... I mean, Michael Owen is a really significant figure because the greatest moment of Sven's England is on September 1st, 2001 in Munich.
Oh, my God.
Where they win 5-1 against, as you say, the
historic
big rival.
enemy.
And Owen scores a hat-trick, I think.
Owen and Heskey, it was the big man, small kid duo.
Yeah. And for the tabloids, it's a kind of collective orgasm after 40 years of waiting for something like this to happen. Nobody'd even imagine it.
Delayed
you go to Germany and you win 5-1. And so everyone's, Sven is a genius, definitely going to win the World Cup.
They were all singing songs about the Luftwaffe. It was so bad.
It was so bad, yeah. Anyway, he walks into the post-match press conference and all the journalists are kind of dancing the conga in the aisles.
Clapping
and
him.
he's not smiling. And he says, well, we were lucky to win 5-1. We were not so good. And he's massively deflating the whole ambience, which is clever because it means that when England lose, he can also deflate. And he's not going along on the hysterical ride. And he says, well, the most important thing that happened tonight is that the German manager, Rudi Völler, his father had a heart attack. And the most important thing is that his father is okay. I really hope for that. So it was a very kind of noble appearance. Any other England manager I've ever seen would have, not Southgate, but all the predecessors of Sven would have milked that moment. Like, you see, I'm a genius.
So after the Germany moment, the 5-1, the hysteria gets ramped up a lot. And Sven suddenly is the guy that is going to fulfill English dreams that haven't been fulfilled since 1966. And one of the things that we saw was a traditional World Cup song. So before every World Cup, the English team has a song. The 2002 World Cup had a song called Sven, 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 by a duo named Bell and Sperling, who I literally don't think have ever made a song ever since. And my plan was to do a bit of singing.
Yeah, no, go for it. I'd love to hear.
But then I looked at the lyrics and I thought, actually, I don't think I can do this. I don't think I can put my heart into this.
This is a song that was introduced on Top of the Pops as sexist and jingoist, I quote.
I don't think the presenter was saying that as a bad thing either. And I'd also add racist. So this is the first lines of the song.
You're not going to sing them, you're just going to...
I don't want to get copyrighted, because if I sing like an angel, we'll get someone will sue us,
No, or you could get picked up,
I could have a whole new career. So the first line of the song is Sven, 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 you're an Goran, they say, of course, which also hurts my sensibilities. Sven-Göran Eriksson. He's got Jimmy Savile's haircut, so how did he get such a lovely girlfriend?
Jimmy Savile, who's later revealed to be one of the leading paedophiles in British history.
I mean, it's just aged so badly. The whole song is full of barely disguised racism towards Germans. And the song is, it is insanely catchy, and I think it does capture the zeitgeist that before the tournament began, Sven was going to be the man. He was going to do it.
If you call a song Sven, 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 you're not really spreading your bets, are you?
No, it's true. This also explains, this song is also a huge reason of why I just couldn't get on board with England. It was nauseating.
And Eriksson was also slightly frustrated by the stupidity of English football culture at that time, because he had these wonderful players and he'd call them in one by one for chats before the match, as he'd been used to doing in, I guess, everywhere he'd coached before. And he'd say to the player, look, in your zone of the field, this is how the opposition's going to play. What do you think our tactics should be in that zone? And the English player would say, I don't know, you're the boss. Because that's what English football was like at the time,
Taking orders.
You take orders, the manager decides everything, any individual initiative is suspect. You don't think on the field, you're just a battler, a warrior. And Eriksson's battle was to get the players to do a bit more thinking. But it was this culture sort of without football tactics. And you see that also in the tabloids, that was never in it. What was in it was what Sven had been doing the night before.
Are we going to get into this steamy love life? I know this is not a podcast
we are no.
Trade is in tittle-tattle.
I think it would be a betrayal of his memory.
It would be remiss of us, I think.
And I think he would want us to relive some of the best moments of his life.
To talk about the fullness of his life.
He seemed to have this magnetic effect on women, perhaps because he was a rare man who actually could listen.
You ask questions and listen, it's done.
Yeah, Sven loved asking questions and listening. He was a guy who hated talking about himself.
He's he's a mysterious, sort of strange creature
I can
in
see
English football.
You can see the appeal.
I can see the appeal.
Yeah.
Let's be honest, I can name 3 of his ex-girlfriends. I don't even know who Gareth Southgate is married to. So, that tells you everything you need to know about how ubiquitous his private life was.
And I think the most famous was Ulrika Jonsson, who was a Swedish weather presenter
woman,
on British TV. And when poor Sven announced that he had terminal cancer in January 2024, Jonsson posts on Instagram stories a picture of herself, says she doesn't have anything to say about Sven and describes him as not a decent person. This is after he's announced he has terminal cancer. She later deletes the post. She had this fling with him very soon after he arrived in England. She later wrote about that. Remember him, the former England manager? Yes, I am also trying to forget it, because sex was about as exciting as assembling an IKEA bookcase. So, ouch, yes.
She was also the perfect, girlfriend or mistress, because she was also tabloid fodder. Ulrika Jonsson was always in the tabloids because she was this leggy Swedish weather woman, and therefore, she's exactly what tabloid readers wanted to see, close or near enough to page 3 often.
It's the ideal kind of celebrity story. It's 2 celebrities from different celebrity fields. Yeah. So you get everyone who's interested in Ulrika and everyone who's interested in Sven.
And they're both Swedish. It's just perfect.
Yeah, it was perfect. This is a huge story because Sven has arrived in England with another girlfriend, Nancy.
The very, very glamorous Nancy Dell'Olio.
Yeah, Italian lawyer, part American Jewish, part Italian. Nancy's always in the papers anyway. And now there's Ulrika. When the Ulrika story breaks, it is huge. I think The Sun later runs the headline, 6 Days That Shook the World. Sven gives a press conference about the Ulrika affair. The tabloids are asking him about, who you're going to choose, who you're going to pick for your team, Ulrika or Nancy. And Sven is totally calm, faces down the questions, remaining completely collected, so much so that at the end, the tabloid rotters give him an ovation.
Wow.
Yeah, because he's really,
the way he
really
handles
cool.
it.
But what Sven is thinking at this time, and he only says this later, is how do they know? How do they always know where I'm going to be? How come when Nancy and I go to a restaurant, they're there waiting for me outside the restaurant? How come when I go to Heathrow to go on holiday, they're at the terminal waiting to photograph me? And so he starts to think, how do they know everyone I'm sleeping with? And he starts to think, maybe these women are telling the papers.
Yeah, he becomes very paranoid.
At one point, he suspects that his brother is leaking to the tabloids. And so he develops this paranoia, which is completely understandable. And only years later does he get summoned to Scotland Yard by the police. And the police tell him, look, your cell phone has been bugged for many years while you were England manager. And Sven suddenly understands there was nobody around me leaking to the press. The women I was sleeping with were not leaking to the press. It was all because my phone had been tapped.
And he was one of hundreds and hundreds of victims of phone tapping done by the tabloids, mainly the News of the World, which was the supreme tabloid of the era and which has since been shut down for this criminal activity.
The News of the World got shut down after they hacked the phone of a girl who had disappeared and was killed.
Millie
Dowler. And it's one of the disgraceful episodes of British public life. Because if you were anyone in British public life in those days, whether you were the England manager or a Labour politician, or just somebody like Hugh Grant, who is a celeb, your private life is not private anymore. It was a terrible imposition on these people.
There's also a broader culture. So Sven says that he didn't understand why coming from Italy and also Sweden and Portugal, where private lives were not private, because the English media have this sort of maxim, which is, well, if you're cheating on your wife, what else are you lying about? Who else are you cheating on?
Well, they used to have that. Now that's sort of gone. Right, so now public figures are allowed to commit adultery. It's not typically considered a story. And this is all as a reaction to the heyday of the News in the World. And now we have to think about things like public interest. So there's far less of that. But in his day, that was the overriding motivation of why a journalist would justify writing. The motivation was it's sexy.
Yes, so the justification
they gave was
if you're cheating on your wife, then what other horrible things are you lying about? And that's the one that they definitely applied to politicians. And you don't have those attitudes, for example, in France or in Italy or in most of continental Europe, where people's private lives don't need to be exposed because they're allowed the right to one.
But I think Sven was also unlucky in the era, because it's the era when the tabloids have loads of readers, loads of money, and they're shamelessly phone hacking.
And they're paying police officers and law enforcement, and everyone's sort of part of this racket. But in some senses, tabloids were right. Sven was cheating on Nancy, and he was also cheating on England. And I think that was a crime that ultimately led to his downfall as England manager, because he was actively engaging in having chats with other clubs about being their manager
all the time
while he was still England manager.
So your club, Chelsea, is, I think, the number one love interest.
Yes, it was a love triangle between Sven, Chelsea and England. If you listen to our Roman Abramovich episode, we talk a lot about how when Abramovich is trying to get into English football, he hires, or at least has all these consultants, so big names in football, who he talks to help him explain the game. And one of them is actually Sven. A few years before Abramovich buys Chelsea, he calls up Sven one day while he's still in Italian football and says, I'm going to meet you in a private members club and I want to talk about football. Sven doesn't have any clue who Roman Abramovich is, but he turns up to this private members club in Mayfair, where you can only get in if you're wearing a suit and a tie. And so Sven is suitably booted up, and then he sees a dude in jeans who's in the club, and he's like, okay, this guy's a pretty important guy. He's already flouted the very strict uniform rules. So he sees Abramovich, and Abramovich says, I'm interested in maybe buying a Russian football club. I'm not sure which one to buy. And Sven was like, it's obvious you have to buy CSKA Moscow. And the chat is very nice. He gives him his advice and they stay in touch. Then he gets a call about a year later, and Abramovich's team says, well, Roman's changed his mind. He wants to buy a London club, and it's between Tottenham or Chelsea. And Sven's like, well, it's obvious he has to buy Chelsea, because at Chelsea you only need to replace about half of the players. At Tottenham, you'll have to get rid of everyone and start again. And that's it. But the relationship does develop. And I think Abramovich sees Sven as maybe a potential manager for one of the many clubs that he wants to buy. And that comes to a head when in 2004, Claudio Ranieri, a man very close to my heart, completely balls up the semi-final of the Champions League, where Chelsea get battered by Monaco, and Abramovich is going to hire his first manager. So he inherited Ranieri. He's done with Ranieri. Sven at this point is still with England, but he knows Sven. He likes Sven. They've had some interaction. Sven gave him some pretty good advice, told him to buy Chelsea. And Sven is very, very tempted by the Chelsea offer, because there is a huge amount of money on the table.
Well, Sven is suffering some regret at having left Lazio for England, because he misses the chance to win trophies every year. In England, you can only win them every 2 years, and your chance of winning them is minute at this point. And you just spend a lot of time hanging around, and he really wants to work. So he's thinking, maybe I'm taking the wrong job. There's also these horrible tabloids who keep harassing me all the time, and it would be more fun to work for a club. So he's having buyer's regret.
And he wants to go. And because his phone's getting tapped, he has a meeting with Peter Kenyon, the then CEO of Chelsea, and he's caught having this clandestine meeting, as it's called.
Telephoto photographs in the sun.
You could think Sven is just completely naive for doing this, but the guy...
Well, Sven is quite naive, as
he is,
admits
but he's
himself
also being stalked and spied upon. So
Yeah.
in some senses, everything that he's done is being watched. He just doesn't know it. It all comes out. It's very embarrassing for the FA. It's very embarrassing for Sven. He then carries 2 tags. 1, that he's a traitor, and 2, that he's also a money grabber. And these are the sort of tags that will stick with him while he's in England for a few years yet. He can't really shake off that reputation.
He also flirts with Manchester United.
Yeah, he admits that he would have actually had a decent offer from United as well.
And then there's the fake sheikh.
Once the tabloids know that Sven is a little bit perhaps avaricious and he's got his eyes on a different club, they think that this is a perfect opportunity to do a sting. And I imagine listeners outside of England will not understand how totemic the figure of the fake sheikh was.
Yeah, I mean, in early 2000s England, the fake sheikh was just a concept that everybody knew.
But also, quite parochially, he was just a brown dude reporter.
Yeah,
who
explain
worked,
the fake sheikh.
So it sounds quite grandiose and, real honey trap. What it really was a guy who was, I think, of South Asian descent. I think he was even Pakistani. He was a reporter for the News of the World. And the News of the World, probably not known for being a diversity employer, thought, you know what, if we get the brown guy to dress up as a rich Arab and he will pose as an investor, as a sheikh, as a wealthy businessman, we can use him to
He was kind of a forerunner of MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, in
who's
football.
a real sheikh. But I often do wonder that if I had entered journalism perhaps maybe
You
10
could have
years
been a
earlier,
fake
I could have
shaker.
been a fake shaker.
Yeah.
Or put a burqa on and pretended to be whoever I wanted to.
Eriksson, gets this call. There's this sheikh who wants to meet you.
He's in
He has a lot of
London, come and
money.
have a cup of tea. And the
Yeah.
sheikh is also wearing a little webcam here. So there's always footage of this interaction. And first they meet Sven and it's all very nice. And they say, well, we're representing some clubs around the Middle East and we have an opportunity for you in Dubai and we're going to pay you insane amounts of money to manage in Dubai. And Sven, at this point, he was like, I like money, but I'm not really going to go to Dubai at this point. And then they dangle the carrot of Aston Villa, which is quite clever. Aston Villa, a very renowned English Premier League team, a credible team to be associated with. And they also say there's loads of money attached to managing this mid-table club. And Sven's like, Aston Villa, yeah, I can do that. And then, of course, this is all revealed in the following Sunday's edition of the News of the World. And it all comes out that Sven, again, having spoken to Chelsea, Manchester United is now willing to take the Aston Villa job because somebody's throwing money at it. This is too much for the FA. It's becoming embarrassing. The leaks, the stories about how disloyal he is, and the FA decide that after the 2006 World Cup, Sven will depart from England.
Also, the kind of agitation against Sven is because England, under him, they're competent. They don't lose often. They get to the quarterfinals, which is better than his predecessors doing. And then they always lose in the quarterfinals, oddly, always against a team managed by Big Phil Scolari. So in 2002...
Then becomes Chelsea manager.
and does become Chelsea manager. And actually is offered the job of England manager, but flees because he just realises immediately that the tabloid persecution is going to be unbearable. And so it starts, they lose to Scolari's Brazil in Shizuoka in 2002, quarterfinals. Brazil are 100 times better, to be fair.
They are.
And then they have these two unfortunate quarterfinals against Portugal. Euro 2004, World Cup 2006. I'm always there. I'm always there at these points. Portugal, really good team. I think in 2004, they have Figo and Ronaldo on the wings. They're really a wonderful football team. No disgrace to lose. England lose on penalties. England always lose on penalties. I mean, one black mark against Sven is that he hadn't worked out that you could actually practice penalties. But he comes out into the press conference in Lisbon in 2004 after this first defeat. To me, there is something godlike about Sven because there's hundreds of hard-bitten football journalists. It's a boiling night, sweaty room, and Eriksson has lost. The best paid coach in the world has lost. England have failed again. Sven stands up and he says, look, I am really sorry about it. Once again, I thought we had a good chance to reach the final here. We did not. I am sorry. And it was bland as he always was. It was as tedious as he always was. But in those circumstances, just remaining tedious and calm was dignified. It was even heroic.
He never broke character, did he?
He never broke character. I think it was because actually the dignified Sven was actually Sven. He wasn't faking it. And when he'd finished talking, these hundreds of hard-bitten, exhausted journalists, they break into applause.
Wow.
Just like after his adultery press conference. And it wasn't because they thought, oh, Sven, you're a brilliant coach. It was because they all thought, you're a good man.
So in between tournaments, after England get knocked out at Euro 2004 and just before the World Cup in 2006, Simon, you went to see Sven.
I was there for 442 magazine. I'm thinking, what am I going to get out of this? Eriksson is always deliberately boring. He's not going to say anything interesting. But what you get, as you know, as a journalist from those interviews, is the person's aura, how they come across and how they treat the people they see around you. So often the interesting things happen before or after you do the interview. So I went to the FA's headquarters on Sloane Square in London. I was immediately, I have to say, charmed by him because he's a very gentle person.
You saw what Ulrika saw at the beginning.
I saw what Ulrika saw, yeah. Because, people say he doesn't have charisma, but in fact, he has this kind of friendly charm, like you're going to see your family doctor. He's kind, he's aware of you being there. This is quite unusual among managers who are often slightly egomaniac, aggressive figures. This workman walked past and Sven turns to him and says, how are you doing? Which, not many massive football managers do. And this is a quality that players often remark about Eriksson. So Beckham and Rooney have said, he always treated us with respect. Yeah. So players are often very complimentary about Eriksson as a man as well. So we go into his office and it's tiny. It's like they scrimped on the office so they could afford the salary. And there's two little desks jammed together. There's a table we can chat at. And there's a sign on the wall saying, talk low, talk slow, and don't say too much, which I guess is the Eriksson family motto. And then maps on the walls, maps of Britain, maps of Germany, where the World Cup's going to be played. It's like a military headquarters. And stacked away, there are boxes of Veuve Clicquot champagne, presumably, just in case they bought the champagne early at a discount. We sit down for the interview, and more or less as we start the interview, his World Cup wall chart falls off the wall. Splat! There's a splat sound behind us, and we both look
The
over.
blue tack failed.
And the blue tack failed, and the wall chart is on the floor. And probably Glenn Hoddle at this point would have resigned. Like, it was a sign from the heavens that, the World Cup is not going to work out. But Sven, totally unruffled. And we talk about all the criticism he gets in the papers. And he says, look, I don't read the newspapers at all. And I say, everyone reads the newspapers in the early 2000s. I said, what, no newspaper is delivered to your house? And he says, no. I say, you don't go out and buy a newspaper. And he says, normally never. And he says, put on the news on the television, you have all the news you need.
He's also on the news on the television. That's the problem.
And he says, in fact, if I buy newspapers, I buy them for the Sudoku. I like that. The Sudoku, that weird crossword puzzle I've never really understood. That also enabled him. He was the only person in England who was not reading newspapers. And so he was the only person who was able to remain unhysterical.
I have a theory that he did actually secretly love all the drama. And he really embraced his celebrity status. Because he's been working in environments, particularly in Italy, where he is surrounded by drama. There's a brilliant story of when he arrives at Lazio and he wants to basically sell the captain, the totemic club captain. And the chairman says, there's absolutely no way.
Who's that?
Giuseppe Signori.
Right, yeah.
He was like, this guy's really negative. He's part of the losing culture of Lazio and I don't want him. But after a couple of months, the chairman thinks, okay, maybe you're right. He gets rid of him. They sell him. The first game, Lazio lose. So obviously Sven is the only man in Italy who drives a Volvo. He's coming out of the match. The fans are literally jumping on his car bonnet and he needs a police escort to leave every time he's coming in and out of the stadium. So I think there's something about Sven that kind of sort of craves the drama, He can handle it. Or he's become inured to all of this stuff.
Yeah,
because
he probably thinks,
everything.
There are people jumping on my Volvo.
Yeah.
I will just wait, then they will go away.
And then I will drive at 20 miles an hour and they will leave.
I mean, I wish for him that England had done a bit better and they could have happened because the penalty preparation, because if you're England manager, you should know we're always going to lose on penalties. So is there something we can do about this? And so they go into the 2006 penalty shootouts against Portugal. Todd Grip, who's Sven's lifelong best friend and assistant, says, well, we picked Jamie Carragher to take a penalty because he'd taken one really well for Liverpool in the Champions League final the year before in Istanbul. And Carragher said later, well, I've watched the video of the 2005 Champions League final many, many times, but I've still never seen myself taking a penalty in the shootout. And so Paul Carragher has to take this penalty against Portugal. And of course, he misses. He doesn't really care, he says, because he didn't really support England anyway. If only they had prepared, it might have made a slight difference.
Yeah, but that match became known they lost on penalties, but the fact that Rooney, the star boy of that tournament, who was almost going to miss the tournament because he was injured, gets sent off. And that becomes another tabloid drama. But I do remember after the press conference, Sven, at this point, he's out, right? He suffered probably, I think, really harsh treatment by the tabloids, but he looks down the camera or to the assorted journalists and says, look, Rooney, don't kill him. You're going to need this guy. You can kill me because you don't need me. He's your golden boy. You've killed me and that's fine because like all other managers, I'm dispensable. But don't do this to this young kid. You're going to need him in the future. And I thought that's, it's in line with the fact that he's heavily protective of his players. The players did love him. He was a face for the team. So he attracted all of the criticism. Yeah. He was a lightning rod for all of the toxic crap. Manager. Yeah. And he handled himself very well. And I thought the comments about Rooney sort of showed, as we've said throughout this episode, what a thoroughly dignified man he was.
Yeah, because there are managers who would have said, oh, we were playing brilliantly, but then that idiot Rooney got sent off and it's because of him that we lost.
Sven, who's been systematically destroyed and had his reputation put into the ground by the tabloids and is now leaving the stage, doesn't want the same thing to happen to Wayne Rooney, a man who's much younger than him, who's barely breaking into English football, and as he sees it, is the golden boy of this generation, that he's going to be the one to carry them forward. And so he gives them a very clear warning and he says, do not kill this boy, you're going to need him. And I think to the tabloids' credit, Rooney does get spared a lot of that sort of toxic treatment that we saw Beckham undergo, for example, after 1998.
But Sven knows this abuse by the entire tabloid media is so hard that although I can take it just fine, most people can't. The end is quite humiliating and painful. What makes it worse is Steve McLaren takes over. And McLaren, right before Sven leaves the England squad, gives a speech to the squad and says, Sven, we want to thank you for your time in England and you're invited to the European Championship final in 2008 because we'll be in it. And Sven is not happy about this at all because it's obviously a dig at him, like you didn't reach the final, but I, Steve McLaren, will. Sven comments years later, I never received an invitation because England, they didn't qualify for 2008.
And Steve McLaren, Sven-Göran Eriksson.
Well, he got the boot.
I love it.
And he was starting to think about what next. He had the biggest job in football. He'd done it pretty well. I mean, match by match, England's winning percentage with Eriksson is 71%, if you count a draw as half a win.
Mm-hmm.
Ulf Ramsey, the legendary English manager, 72%.
Okay.
Gareth Southgate is actually a bit above that. I think Southgate is the most successful England manager in the history of England, match by match. But Eriksson is pretty good. He came in, he made English football a little bit more grown up. It was happening anyway. And he kind of led the way for our other foreign chief executives and sports managers to...
The taboo was broken.
Well, English football at the turn of the century is undergoing this very rapid transition towards a much more continental passing game. And that is led by Arsene Wenger at Arsenal, and it's being copied by other clubs in the Premier League, including your beloved Chelsea. Players are stopping this kind of binge drinking. They're starting to look after themselves. English football is sort of moving towards Italy, let's say. But the England team is the last bit at the top of English football that remains completely English. English players, English manager, English thinking. And so it's starting to become backward compared to the top clubs. If you saw Arsenal around 2000 and England around 2000, the difference was almost embarrassing in sophistication of play. So there was a need for someone like Sven. There was a need for a foreigner to come in to be a kind of Arsene Wenger figure and bring England kicking and screaming into modernity, into the new century, you could say. In a small way, Eriksson changed British society. As a foreigner coming in, bringing foreign methods, making foreignness acceptable even at the highest places in British society, he helped open the country up to the world. Well, Olof Lundh has been waiting patiently outside the studio door, the Swedish journalist and author, and this is the moment where we bring him back in to talk about Sven's legacy, what it all meant, how he'll be remembered. So the England job has really ended in disappointment. They always lose at the quarterfinals. No big team ever wanted Sven again, so he started taking smaller jobs, first of all with Manchester City. But it doesn't really work out. And in fact, in the last game of the season, City lose 8-1 to Middlesbrough, which I think is the worst day of Eriksson's career. And Sven is really just too early, because that summer, 2008, Abu Dhabi's Royals buy Manchester City and turn it into the richest club in the world.
But soon after leaving City, Sven becomes embroiled in probably one of the strangest football frauds that I've ever heard of in my life. And he becomes the director of football for little-known Notts County.
In the lowest division of English football,
League Two.
Yeah, because it's these guys who've come to Sven and said, we're Bahraini royals and we're going to put a lot of money into the club.
This is the height of lunacy in English football around foreign ownership. So people have seen what Abramovich has done. We've got Taksin and then the Abu Dhabis in Manchester City. And Notts County are ripe for new ownership. They're about to go bankrupt. The club is going to be bust. So a mysterious consortium of investors whose name is never revealed in public come to Sven and say, look, we've got a lot of money. We know the Bahraini crown is backing us. And we're also backed by the world's largest commodities company, which is worth over $1 trillion based in Switzerland. Now, Sven, when he gets the offer, actually says, I thought this was incredible. They're giving me money, 4 years, and telling me that I need to get to the Premier League. However, this is all an elaborate scam.
Because this commodities company has supposedly exclusive mining rights in North Korea.
That's why it's the biggest commodities company in the world. And while he's in Pyongyang, he also gets a phone call from Notts County. As a director of football, they call him up and say, Sven, we know you're busy right now, but we don't have enough money at the club to pay for the milk bill in the canteen. And then Sven's like, I think something might be wrong here.
Maybe the world's biggest commodities company is not what it seems.
And the £9 million in shares that he's been promised don't happen. And eventually the scam is revealed in its fullness. The fake investors are not the Bahraini crown. So technically, Sven has been fake shaked twice in his life.
There is a gullibility about Sven, isn't there, Olof?
I think it's that he really wanted to believe that people were what they said they were. You could say that he was naive, but I think it's kind of like where he grew up. That's why you trusted people.
And it ends disastrously for him. He says that financially, he lost everything. And he says it was one of the biggest mistakes of his life. Sven says, I was born poor but happy. Then I became a little wealthy. And then I lost everything and became poor again. So again, he's very stoic about this incredible story, which was financially ruinous for him.
Yeah, and it was also his financial advisor who tricked him. And he lost a lot of money. And after being pretty rich, he had a really tough time to pay for everything.
And that's part of the reason he ends up in the Chinese Super League. He needs to take these jobs basically to recover some semblance of financial stability.
And none of them really work out in football terms. He coaches Mexico, Ivory Coast, the Philippines, but there's no kind of second act or third act in his footballing life.
I know that when I met him for a long interview, he said he regretted that he left Europe. He should never have left Europe, gone to Mexico, Ivory Coast and all that, because after that, the value of his name kind of plummeted.
But even in these years of failure, he sort of remains Sven. He remains Svenis, as Swedes call him Svenis, right?
Svenis, yeah, that's what he's called.
You know, Hans Backer, who's with him in some of these coaching jobs, he said, you know, he would still remember everyone's name, everyone who worked in the kitchen. If a trialist teenager came from South Africa, Sven would sit down with the kid. He tried to find out where his players came from. He made sure that they felt seen. He talked to players about how they'd handle Ramadan. He'd ask, you know, does your wife have a job? How are the kids doing at school? So just like Beckham and Rooney loves him, all these players, they always love him, right?
I would feel that that's the way he was working. I don't think he changed the way he was working, even though he got smaller jobs.
When we talk about legacy, it's remarkable how many of his former players or the players that he coached have become great managers. And Sven speaks about these players like a proud father. Some of the ones that he's most impressed by, of course, Roberto Mancini, who I think is probably his favourite player of all time. But he also coached Carlo Ancelotti at Roma and Diego Simeone at Lazio. And these are now, you know, the titans of managership in current modern football. And to some extent, I think Sven feels that he played a little role in their journey to being a coach.
Definitely. He was proud that players that he had coached turned out to be great coaches.
And just by virtue of the fact that this is a man whose career spanned the 80s to the 2010s, he's known every single football magnate and massive investor from Silvio Berlusconi. He was one of the sort of semi-consultants hired by Roman Abramovich, who used to call him up when he had some footballing questions. So he sort of saw the whole gamut of football owners and completely mad rich men with huge egos. I mean, did he enjoy this kind of lifestyle and this milieu? And was he sort of seduced by this sort of glamorous world of football owners and businessmen?
I think he was seduced in a way. Of course, he wanted to make some money, and that's why he was kind of tricked. But he trusted people, and he respected a lot of people. And I think he also wanted to be part of these circles. When Abramovich wants to buy a club in England, he feels flattered that he turns to him.
And there is one job that he never did, which was the manager of Sweden. And Simon, you've got a story about that. Well, he was at Notts County.
Hans Backer says they're at Notts County, and Sven gets this call, you know, do you want to manage Sweden? And Sven says, no, I have to remain loyal to Notts County. I cannot break this contract, although he was quite happy to break contracts before. But I guess the lure of the Pyongyang holidays was too much.
Sven tried to get if he could do Sweden on the side and have Notts County. That was not anything the federation wanted. So it kind of ended in a bad way, where he and the federation chairman, they were kind of slinging mud at each other in the newspapers. Did he really get an offer or did he not? And I think that's a little bit sad for Sven that he didn't get the job. And I think a lot of Swedes feel that the greatest Swedish coach ever, he never coached Sweden.
So his career winds down. There's no more success. And then in January 2024, he gives this quite shocking interview to P1, a Swedish radio channel.
Yeah, it's the equivalence of BBC, their big Sunday interview. And they had kind of asked Sven to do an interview with them. Everyone in Sweden knew that Sven was ill, but we didn't know what. It's a shock when it comes out that he's just open with it, that he has this terminal cancer. And I think also people were taken aback of how relaxed, can you say that? He was, I'm trying to enjoy my days. It goes up and down and doesn't help if I whine about it. He kind of took it like he took a lot of things in life, which kind of took people aback. It was shocking in two ways. He was terminally ill, but he also was kind of, in a way, relaxed about it.
I've read the transcript of the interview. There's no self-pity at all. It's very stoic.
Very stoic.
And the interview, he's quite reflective. He talks about a lot of things, and he says, football has been like a poison for me, you could say, a good poison. It has kind of come before everything else in life, for better or worse. And the interviewer says, right, you've sacrificed many relationships for football. And Sven says, yes, I have. And he talks about his divorce, which he says in part due to football.
In a way, I think he's reflected a lot about his life the last years. He kind of saw what he had paid for prices, but he also valued what he had gotten from football. I think he kind of ended up, when he made his equation, it was okay that he had sacrificed a lot because football was so important for him. It had taken him all over the world, and all the experiences he had, he cherished them, and he kind of understood that he had to sacrifice a lot.
I mean, I found this last bit of the interview quite moving. He's talking about his illness, and he says, life is what it is, and make the best of it. And the interviewer says, where did you get that attitude from? And Sven says, I think I got it from my parents, especially my father. Calm, composed, don't get excited about little things. Dad probably thinks life is good because his father is 95 and still going. And he said, I think mother did that too for as long as she lived. We Värmlanders are a bit like that, I think. I've always been a pretty positive individual. So he kind of gives his credo.
Yeah, and it's the upbringing, it's the parents who never took anything fancy for granted. They didn't demand very many things.
Scandinavians of that generation are said to live according to the law of Jante. I'm probably mispronouncing it, but can you tell us what that is? Because it seems to be a kind of guiding light of Sven's.
Yeah, it's actually a Norwegian who moved to Denmark, Jante, who wrote this. And it's, you're not supposed to be something that you're not. You're not supposed to be fancy. You're not to get a new car or brag or anything like that.
You're not better than anyone else.
Exactly. You're supposed to keep a very low profile, no show-offs in a way. And some people can experience Jante as kind of like pushing them down, not be able to express themselves. But I think he kind of accepted it, that that's not the way we should do it. We should keep a low profile.
He lived by the law of Jante.
Very much he lived by the law of Jante. Of course, there are parts in his life when there was not that much Jante. He kind of left Jante in Sweden. And
well, he always, I think, in these crazy environments where he was treated as a saint and a demigod, he still had it in his head.
Definitely he carried it with him, but of course he was affected. And I can feel that it's so great that he was, in a way, at least in my eyes, resurrected as a great coach, because after the years in England and all the tabloid writings and love affairs and clubs and the jobs that weren't that exciting, he was, in a way, ridiculed in Sweden. He was someone who we joked about. And I'm so happy that he was kind of resurrected, and that we cherished the way he was a human being and all he did as a coach.
So he's not just a great Swedish coach, he's also become again a Swedish national treasure.
He has become such a treasure, and people really value what he did and how he kind of spread the world of Sweden and how he worked. I think that was an immense pride of Swedes. All the titles he won and all the teams he took care of, and that the Swede could manage England and all other those fancy clubs. It was incredible. And it's great that we've discovered it again and that we kind of give him the credit that he's due.
Hans Backer said to me, he is by far the greatest football manager Sweden has ever produced.
I would say that no one is really close to him, because to keep going at that level for such a long time, at a time when the world was opening up and the competition was harder, there's no one who's even close to Sven-Göran Eriksson.
So Sven, who was a huge Liverpool fan because of his father, manages to fulfill, I guess, a childhood and managerial dream, which is to be at Anfield and to manage an Anfield team, because in March 2024, there's an incredibly emotional testimonial match which is held, and Sven is in the home dugout. Yeah,
it was incredible, and it was really his dream. And I think it has a lot to do with his father and the Liverpool supportership, and that they had watched Liverpool together, that Sven had this dream. And I mean, to be able to walk out to Anfield, you'll never walk alone, and a lot of legends both in Liverpool and Ajax, and then to be able to know that your father is watching this, because every TV channel in Sweden broadcasted this game. Everyone was watching it because it was such a special occasion.
And his father, aged 95, is there to witness his terminally ill son walk out at Liverpool coaching a Legends team.
And there's this incredibly moving moment at the end of the match where the Liverpool fans do a rendition of You'll Never Walk Alone. And, you know, in this podcast, we're often very cynical about football and and we, you know, take the mickey out of it. But it was a genuinely moving moment. I mean, I cried and I think most of my family members who were watching it also cried.
But yeah, that was beautiful. I think in the end, it matters that you were a good person. And when you're dying, football fans see Sven, they don't think, oh, he lost in quarterfinals. They think he was a good man.
Now, they probably think that they did mistreat him a little bit too, I imagine. And one of the things that I've noticed about him speaking about his life is he never complains about any of it. He's never said, I was hard done by. He's never felt like he was a victim. He looks back on the fullness of his life. And
even when he's dying, he doesn't complain about dying.
He's incredibly grateful for everything that happened from his very humble origins. He's lived an incredible life.
He was a really humble person, and every time you spoke to him, he was so grateful for every experience he had, every door that opened, every club he managed, every player, and that made him such a great human being, I think.
His relationships with women all ended, and he has left behind 3 children, a Swedish son and daughter, and then he says, I have a bonus child, Alcides, in Panama, which is clearly a whole nother story. That phrase, bonus child, really struck me.
It's a common saying in Sweden when you meet a partner who has a child with someone else.
I mean, we remember him for football, we remember him for the victories, for the defeats. But in the end, I hope this doesn't sound too hokey, but we remember him as a good man.
I also feel the kind of sadness when figures from your childhood who loom very large in your life start passing away, and Sven is one of those. And I don't know, there's something reminds you of your own mortality when the heroes of your young life are no longer around, because that means that you're next in line.
Yeah, it's always hard when people you respect move on, and you lose kind of your bearings of society, I think. And Sven has been someone who's been there for Swedish football and Swedish society, and a beacon of something, and suddenly it's gone. It's very hard to fathom that situation.
So R.I.P. Sven, have a wonderful afterlife. Thank you for listening to Heroes and Humans of Football. For more information, go to our website at heroesandhumans.com.
And follow us at Heroes and Humans on all social platforms. This show was developed by Immaterial and produced by One Fine Play. Matt Cheney is the series producer. Kazra Firuzia is the editor and producer. We have been your hosts, Mehreen Khan
and Simon Cooper.
And this has been Heroes and Humans of Football.